This is Shamtoli Haq. I'm with Law at the Margins. I'm here today with Jeree Thomas. Jeree Thomas is the founder of Liberatory Imagination. Welcome, Jeree. So I
Thank
wanted to start first, just jump into it to give us a sense of your background in movement work and just a general introduction about you just introduction about yourself.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Jeree Thomas, go by she, her pronouns. I'm based in Virginia, uh, just south of Richmond on Monacan lands. And my background in movement work is that I started my career as an attorney representing kids who were incarcerated here in Virginia, looking at their educational needs, but also trying to get them out of incarceration. I ran a statewide campaign to close youth prisons here in Virginia, and then did national policy work trying to get young people out of the adult criminal legal system, really addressing and trying to eliminate the placement in adult jails and prisons of young people. And then I became the program officer and then the program director of the Communities Transforming Policing Fund at Borealis Philanthropy and was there for about 6 years. And now I am the founder of Liberatory Imagination. I have the honor of working on the In Defense of Movements project, and I'm an active member of the Richmond Community Bail Fund.
Can you share a little bit more about in defensive movements? What is it, and what is the work, and what are sort of the principles that guide that work?
Yeah, so the In Defense of Movements project really developed organically. It was a partnership between several different funders, funder organizers, and strategists who started to notice, and really, this is a long time issue, but noticed that movements were particularly organizations after 2020 experienced what we call political prosecutions, meaning that it seemed that they were being prosecuted, criminalized, surveilled, specifically because of their political viewpoint, and because of their work organizing and building a base of folks to push back against state violence, to push back against the marginalization and criminalization of their communities. And so we started in order to support organizations across the country that were facing that. And in particular, I want to really highlight and bring into the space Tortuguita, who's on my shirt, who's an activist. They were activists that was murdered by the police while protesting the deforestation in Atlanta and the building of the police training facility. And they really had a substantial impact, right, in mobilizing a movement against the building of what was termed Cop City. And so that was some of the work that the In Defense of Movements Project started organizing around and really trying to organize and mobilize resources to support the organizers there, as well as unfortunately, after those organizers were criminalized, and in fact, 61 activists were charged with RICO. The bail fund there received additional charges around charity fraud. All of it was very clear and evident that they were being criminalized for organizing against a police training facility, organizing in support of those who experienced police violence. And in fact, I will say that some news came out just in this week in September that those RICO charges are being considered and being dropped, likely being dismissed by the judge. And so after 2 years, after a 2 year legal fight, and so that truly is the heart of the In Defense of Movements project and the work that we do. We accompany and support and mobilize resources around individuals that are facing political prosecution, particularly for their work representing and supporting Black and Indigenous people of color and other marginalized communities.
Great. It's there are historical examples where the criminal legal system has been used against Black and Brown people and social movements. So the kind of the type of law like RICO is new, but we know that this has been kind of a playbook of sorts. And so it's so important for us to understand the kind of the history. And I want to turn back, I want to kind of maybe zoom out a little bit because you have such a wealth of experience from, being an attorney, being in movement spaces, philanthropy, and now you founded Liberatory Imagination. So can you just speak a little briefly about what that is and why you came to, start this project? And then just wanted to then move into a little bit of assessment of where are we, where is the movement? Because I think you have that broad vantage point that would be useful for us to hear.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I started Liberatory Imagination because first and foremost, I care deeply, deeply about communities that are facing marginalization, criminalization. That's been the heart of my work and my purpose my entire career. And I wanted to have the space to support as many folks as I can, and importantly to make connections because I think in this particular moment that we're in, solidarity is survival. Like we have to find ways to connect with each other, to share resources, to share strategies, and to support and keep each other safe. And so I wanted to start an organization of an a business that would allow me to really do that work organically with as many people as I can support. So I'm just deeply honored to be in the space and to have the ability to, at this point, really partner with lots of different people, different organizations that are doing incredible work, and are standing strong in this moment.
Yeah, and I think I was drawn to the name particular because our series is Law and Liberation. And I'm gonna come back and, ask you what does liberation mean and look like to you. But before we get there, just you began to make an assessment of kind of where we are and what the movement needs are. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about that, in terms of what are the needs, where do you think social movements, of course, each movements are different, but just to kind of get some lessons learned that we might be able to share that informs, your current work.
Yeah. So when I think about the current political moment and where movements are, I always like to think in terms of generations. I like to think historically. One of my favorite books from the past couple years is a book called Healing Justice Lineages. And
Mm,
what that book does really beautifully is tie and connect the work of organizers, of abolitionists, right? Of folks who were fighting for their communities, for Black and Brown communities, right? For queer and trans communities for generations.
mm,
And they also really help to ground in the fact that unfortunately, our nation has been, our communities within our country have been under fascism, under authoritarianism before, right? Like, and that there
mm,
are lessons to learn from previous organizers, from our ancestors, from other, right? There are lessons to learn. And we should always remember that so that we can hold that history with our current moment and not despair, but
mm,
have hope, right? That the fact that the reason why I'm here is because my ancestors survived state violence. They survived enslavement for generations. And so the very fact of my existence is hope. And the very fact of so many of our existence here, it is the hope that we need. And so we have to start there. And I also believe that a lot of what we need is that connection. We need to know that we have each other's backs. We need to know who has what skills, who has what thing, right? So that we can help support each other. That is, I believe, the way that we're going to survive this moment. It's one of the reasons why I think mutual aid, I think Bell funds, I think other things are so critical for us to have and for us to be connected to, in addition to the movement infrastructure, the broader movement infrastructure that we need. And so I will pause. I will pause there because I know that you were going to ask me, I think, about that.
Yeah, no, it's I do want to maybe ask you to elaborate the point that you made, which is that we have ex at least we meaning in the United States, because Law and Liberation also will engage with folks throughout doing organizing work in other parts of the world, have experienced, as you mentioned, state violence, but you mentioned fascism, authoritarianism. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think kind of the dominant thinking is that, oh, we're approaching fascism. We haven't gotten there yet. But from your comment, it seems that no, we've actually experienced this before historically. Could you share examples and elaborate a bit of what you mean? Because I think that's a really important intervention in how we think about our movement history, right?
Yeah. So I wanted to name the fact that for some communities within the United States, fascism and authoritarianism are not new. And I wanted to name that because, as someone who is a descendant of enslaved people, I think we have to reckon with the reality that for a long time, for generations and generations, Black people, I know Indigenous people, others were enslaved, right? Were not even treated as human beings, did not have access to their own freedom, right? And so I think it's important to acknowledge that and to recognize that not everyone in our country have had the same rights and the same access to democracy. And in fact, we're living under regimes in which they couldn't their movement, the ability to have property, their families, everything was controlled. And was controlled by people that specifically categorized them in that way in order to retain power, in order to amass wealth and resources, and that we are living in the long shadow of that. And so that is one thing I want to name. Obviously, Jim Crow laws are also examples of that. The fact that you had Black folks being lynched in communities, and that being in some ways sometimes sanctioned, right, by the other powers that be in that community. Like, that is our history in our country. And so it's important that we remember that, and that we also remember that we aren't there anymore, right? We were able to make really important advancements, and we have to remember what those advances were and what they took. Because the truth is, unfortunately, we know that Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and others, Fred Hampton, right? We think of the people who ended up giving their lives for the recognition that Black people, that all people should be treated equally in our country and should have access to the democracy that America claims to have. But that hasn't always been the case, right? Like, it's important that we acknowledge that, and that in fact the generations, the decades in time in which Black people, women, queer and trans people have had rights is unfortunately not that long, right? So the fact that we are now in this point where things are being rolled back, where unfortunately not only state governments but the federal government, it's also rolling back. Like, yes, it is absolutely a detrimental experience. Yes, it is jarring, especially after having access to these rights for decades and decades. But it is important to always remember that we were not always in this place, that there is opportunity for advancement and progress, right? And that there are ways and strategies to make it through, because folks generations before us were able to do it, and I believe that we can too.
That's so powerful, because I think you remind us that, how US constitutional democracy has existed side by side by the brutality and
Yeah.
displacement of Native folks and the enslavement of Afro-descendant folks and then of course expulsion of migrants, and that
Yes.
this is a form of authoritarianism. And I think that's what I'm hearing, and that these law and as lawyers,
Yes.
we have to understand the way that the law has been complicit in that. On one hand, hey, equal amendment, due process, and at the same time, there is the lynching and the violence, and I want to come back to, because political violence and political persecution is something that's kind of people are talking about it now,
Mhm.
and so I want to come back to that. But before I do, just on the point of history, what lessons you mentioned that that communities that have been marginalized have survived, and
Yeah.
that the hope is from the survival. What lessons can we draw from past movements, concrete lessons that you think that we can kind of take away, to the extent that you can name or refer folks who are listening to concrete examples or campaigns, that would be great. But what lessons could we draw from our history before I want to come back to the contemporary? Yeah.
There are so many lessons that we can draw from history. And it's one of the reasons why I try my best to always be in and study around how everyone from Harriet Tubman, right? Like how to Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King, like how folks were able to move um in the moments that they were in and under the real, the real detrimental states that they were within. I think some of the lessons that come to mind is one, the importance of solidarity. I think about the work that Martin Luther King, how for him to, especially towards the end of his life, like he was fighting on many different fronts. It wasn't just only about Black civil rights, right? Like he understood the importance of worker rights. He understood the importance of looking at militarism and issue, right? Like the appreciation that all of our movements are closely tied and connected is really, really important. I think about Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party in terms of the free breakfast, right? Free like the other idea around mutual aid and around the importance of taking care of those in your community and how that is a part of building power towards the change that you want to see. I think that's really, really important. I think it's important that um, I, I think about actually more in a more recent sense. I had the honor of getting to know Michael Brown Sr. and his wife Cal, who are the parents, a parent and step parent of Michael Brown Jr., who was murdered
Yes.
by Ferguson police. And they have built, in the now a little over a decade since they lost Michael Brown Jr., they have built a community that relies and supports each other around healing when you've lost a loved one to state violence or to really any violence. And I think about again how that is so important, how being able to lean on each other, how being able to heal together, and then using that connection to push for change, to advocate not only for change for your family and the loved one you lost, but to hopefully make it so it doesn't happen again. But if it does happen again, to be able to have a space where people know that they have community and support. So I think there are lessons not only historically, but even in the more recent past. There are people that are actively doing this work that we can continue to learn from, as well as a long legacy of what it means to take care of each other, to keep each other safe, to recognize that is really, at the end of the day, the most important thing that we can do for each other.
I'm so glad that you talked about this solidarity on this sort of individual level. At Lot the Margins, we talk about embodied solidarity and community care, and that the way in which marginalized communities historically have been able to really deal with the onslaught of state violence has been precisely what the Brown family and other families have done. Mothers on the move, like Mothers of the Movement,
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, that's important is to honor those because oftentimes, because we're serious movement people, so we always talk about strategies, campaigns, and I also appreciate you for focusing on the importance of healing, of really building that relational aspect of our work. So if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more, I welcome you. And then I wanted to talk about a concept that you developed around participatory philanthropy and grant making and resources. But before I jump to that, um, I know you mentioned healing lineages, you mentioned healing in this previous response. Anything that you'd like to share a little bit more about, how to the extent that the sort of healing, the community care, because I don't really believe in self-care, quite honestly, but how we heal and together, maybe from your work and from your perspective, because I think that's really not often. I feel like that sometimes it's kind of more, it's like shunned because it's like, oh, you're being soft and that's not serious enough.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you for, throughout our conversation, you've used that word healing a number of times and just wanted to pause to give a moment if you wanted to speak to that, elaborate on that a bit.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the need for collective care in this moment. A lot of the tactics that we are seeing against people, the targeting, the criminalization, it is meant to be isolating. It is meant to break individuals down, right? And so it is, I believe, only through building community. It is through having that space to heal together, to empathize with each other around what is happening, and then to say, okay, so how do we support each other? That is at the end of the day what is going to get us through. Because if when you don't have that support, when there isn't that healing, it is very easy to be overwhelmed by the reality of the world that we're in today, right? It is. I mean, it's just
Mm.
the conditions are really, really overwhelming. And so that is why I think that's why I really emphasize the collective care aspect of movement work. Yes, we absolutely need to have strategy. We absolutely need to have campaigns. We absolutely need to have all of those legal support, all of those things. And we need to make sure that we are okay. We need to make sure that we are here in the long run, that the generations after us can exist, right? And so for that reason, we do need to figure out how to take care of each other, even if we don't have asked, even if we are unable to access state resources and other things, right? So I think, and I just wanted to give this example because they are top of mind. I think about the tornado that went through St. Louis earlier this year. I think it was in May of this year, and it was a lot of the members of the Black community, Black-led organizations there that took it upon themselves to make sure people had what they needed
Mhm.
um, in a moment when FEMA was not offering resources to that community. And that's just to me, that is an example of the fact that there is not always going to be some structure or institution that is willing to support and help us. So we have to build up that muscle within our own communities, and we have to build up those connections as well.
That's a great segue to the kind of area that I wanted to talk about is really the allocation, marshaling of resources. You have written about this in the context of your role in philanthropy. You talk about philanthropy being aligned with movements. I don't know if you coined this term, but participatory grant making. I was wondering if you can share specifically what is it? What does that look like? And then I wanted to turn back to, you mentioned bail funds, mutual funds, these non-state forms of resource mobilization.
Mhm.
Because I think that's a very important part of movement work is everyone's like, oh, we don't have funds to do this, and how do we do the work? But you've mentioned that communities have historically sort of marshaled their own resources, and mutual aid is kind of a key example of that. So again, to a little bit more about this concept that you've written about being aligned with movements.
Yes. So I had the really privilege of doing participatory grant making work while I was leading the Communities Transforming Policing Fund. And what that looks like is that individuals, or at least in that specific case, was that individuals who have been directly impacted by policing, criminalization, and incarceration and who were a part of organizations or working alongside organizations that were trying to combat the harm caused by those institutions were then in a position to make the decisions about the multi-year grants that the fund, the Community Transforming Policing Fund, gave out. And so I had the honor of working with just an incredible group of individuals. Those individuals were actually selected by the grantee partners that the fund had previously, because
Mm,
essentially that particular fund was very, very small when it started, and then was able to raise resources
mm,
following 2020, following the murder of George Floyd. And a deep interest and understanding that there was a real issue around police violence. And so when those resources grew, we were able to transition to participatory grant making and have individuals who themselves, I mean, we had some just tremendous individuals, including I want to shout out so many people, but thinking about Tan Sublet, who is the director of programs at the Chicago Torture Justice Center. She
mm,
herself was a victim of police torture, one of the few female survivors who's speaking out about her experience, but also helping others heal from that experience. And that organization, Chicago Torture Justice Center, is so special because it is actually the only center in the country that was created out of a reparations ordinance,
yes.
reparations for police violence in Chicago. And so that's one, I think, powerful example of what can happen when individuals who have experienced things themselves are part of building out solutions and helping others. But yes, so participatory grant making is all about that. And for 4 years while I was at the fund, we had our different committee members make decisions around and end up, I think they selected around 26 organizations across the country
Mm,
every year that were doing work to try to reduce the size, scope, and power of policing, trying to decriminalize communities. I'm trying to make sure that resources go to where communities want to see resources go, whether it's more employment, jobs, housing, all of those things. So very, very powerful work. I think to me, there is nothing like the power of people who deeply, deeply know the impact that systems have being leads on deciding where those resources go. Not only because they deeply know, but also because they are connected to many and communities that are doing this work, and they themselves are continuing to do the work.
I think that's such an important point of that, those who are most impacted, we know that they know the issue, but I think what you are adding is to sort of have a say in the resources that are being allocated. And so we talk about this as community investment. And I think that oftentimes, we talk about defunding the police, we talk about reinvesting in the community, and it's really about reallocation, redistribution of resources, which is why I thought your perspective on that is really important to remind us that, we can marshal resources and then we can also channel them towards what's needed. Are there
Yes.
other examples of organizations that have done that, where you've talked about the philanthropy, the philanthropy context, and you mentioned the Chicago reparations bill. Are there other examples where communities have kind of reoriented resources back to the community that maybe we should amplify?
Yes. So, and I will say definitely after 2020, there were a number of different efforts. Organizations across the country were really pushing for money to be reallocated, not only to other resources, but to alternatives to policing. So you saw the growth of really powerful community-based safety programs,
Yes.
where people had other folks that they could call instead of the police when they needed support. And so I think about the Black Response Cambridge that helped to build out Cambridge Heart, which is a great example. I believe there's a Rally Heart. There's several different hearts that are all alternative responder programs. I think of Relationships Evolving Possibilities in Minneapolis that also again came out of the 2020 uprisings and the murder of George Floyd. I also think about what happened in Austin, Texas, where they were able to actually remove some resources from the policing budget and put it towards different things, including a guaranteed income pilot.
Mhm.
And there's a great organization called Embody Transformation there that is building off of that pilot and trying to and launching a program called Roots of Care, where they are doing a guaranteed income pilot for caretakers. And in addition, they are providing political education and leadership development to those caretakers so that if they want to advocate further, not only for themselves, but for their community, they have the skill sets and the connections and the relationships to do so. And so I've continued to see a number of examples where folks are able to show like here is what we could be doing and resourcing instead to strengthen our community.
There's a couple of things that we talked about before, so I want to make sure if there were threads you wanted to elaborate on, and talk about. We've talked about political persecution in the past, and we know that political persecution now is very much central political violence. Um, do you want to elaborate on some of those themes before we begin to kind of maybe wind down with a couple of like quick kind of hot take type questions?
Okay. Yes. So we're in a really interesting moment because I will say, and what I've seen historically, political prosecutions were relatively narrow, right? Like they were very focused in on certain types of organizations and activists and individuals. And particularly the work that I did, it was a lot of organizations that were, pushing back against police violence, that were really calling for accountability when tragedies occurred. And so wanting to share again the example of the Stop Cop City movement and the 61 activists there that are still under charges for the organizing work that they did pushing back against Cop City. And so that that happened. That particular case happened and it started in 2023, during again a time when it seemed pretty limited, right? But now we're in a different moment. We are seeing more and more people being criminalized, some for just the work that they're doing, right? We are seeing judges, we're seeing lawyers, we're seeing legislators, right, experience criminalization and experience prosecution as a result because of their viewpoint. Um, and so with that expansion of political prosecutions, we are in a moment where folks really have to think about and ground and what this is. And I believe that what a big part of what it is the fact that criminalization is really central to authoritarianism. And we have to understand that as what is happening in this moment. In order to in order to do whatever you want to do to a community of people, you have to dehumanize them. And the fastest way that we dehumanize people in America is we criminalize them, right? Like that is what we have done historically. It's the reason why we have, a 13th Amendment, but we leave in there that if you're a criminal, right? If you're a criminal, then you can experience slavery, right?
Mhm.
The dehumanization through criminalization is how authoritarianism really works. And we're starting to see that more and more, right? We're seeing that impact our immigrant communities. We're seeing that impact just more and more people because then you can control
Yes.
even when people are not doing anything that's criminal. And so it's it is it is, I think, a unfortunate new reality for more and more people that more and more folks have to reckon with. But my sincere hope is that it creates some understanding and solidarity for the communities that have been facing this for generations. I was at a jail this morning posting bail for someone. I every week I see how the just general hum of how people are treated in our criminal legal system is so dehumanizing,
Hmm.
right? So I want people to understand that even once we are no longer in the moment that we are currently in, we still need to do something about how criminalization dehumanizes people, and that when folks are incarcerated, right, when folks are detained, um, those are still human beings, and we need to treat them like human beings, and that is a part of what I think our democracy on the other side of this needs to be very clear about.
I think you're that was so powerful about the way in which authoritarian governments use the criminal legal system and the reminder that um, you know, even if, sort of we no longer have a Trump or a different administration, the criminal legal system that the administration is utilizing existed before him. And I think that what you just mentioned is we need to pay attention to that. So a couple of quick questions and to then wind down, which has been just a profound and conversation is, are there other things social me movements need to be attentive to? You mentioned criminal legal system and really challenging that. Are there other things social movements need to be pay attention to that we're not?
Mm. I I've honestly, I feel like in this moment, there's so many things that I wouldn't say that people aren't paying attention to it. I would say that folks are stretched so thin, right? That there's so many things to pay attention to in this moment that's really the difficulty.
Mm,
I think that going back to the question around movement infrastructure, I think that this moment has also showed us the importance of both like local infrastructure, right? That especially when you're doing legal cases, you need like local attorneys that have experience and relationships and knowledge of how that local like how that local community works, right? Especially depending on the types of prosecutions that you're experiencing. So I'm again thinking about Atlanta and Stop Cop cities. Like you need to have built out the legal defense support, the bail support, the mutual aid support, the organizers who are getting the word out, the communicators who are helping to shine a bright spotlight on what is happening and helping to show like, hey, like let's be very clear about what's happening and helping to steer that narrative towards that reality. Like all of those pieces are really, really key. You really need to have all of them.
mhm,
Um, it can't be that you rely only on, let's say, lobbying, but not doing any organizing and not doing any communicating. It is really important. And I do hope people appreciate that, especially in the philanthropic context, that we need a really holistic picture of a really holistic view of the necessary infrastructure for movements, starting at that support at a local scale, as well as having national infrastructure that helps bring and bridge together individuals from, those different local ecosystems.
Great. Um, I think because you mentioned the different types of lawyering, and you yourself as a lawyer, you went. What would you say to young lawyers, emerging, aspiring movement lawyers from your own work? Any wisdom, lessons? Um,
The biggest lesson, and I'm sure many young lawyers and many law students can appreciate, is that what is what is right is not always legal, and what is legal is not always right. And
mm,
while law is one tool that we can use to try to push back against harmful things that we see happen, it cannot be our only tool. It just can't. It's not sufficient, right? And so it's important to appreciate the role that you play because it is a critical role, but it's also important to appreciate all the other parts of the movement, right? From the organizing to the communicators, right? Like all the other aspects that need to come together, and need to be a part of the strategy in order for anything to get done. And so making sure that whatever you do with your legal education, with your litigation skills, is really grounded in the reality too of people's experience, and their lived experience. I think that's the other really important thing because you can have things written down, things can be in the law, they can be in the regulations, but not be the experience that people have in their everyday lives. And for me, the most important thing is what are people actually experiencing in their everyday life, and how can we make sure that we are getting to that level of support?
Great. So, a couple of things I wanted to ask you, and I'm just looking back into my notes. You had this concept on your website called anti-racist community development. I was wondering if you could just briefly, if I read that right, to explain what you meant, because that's not something I've had read or seen before that I thought was kind of innovative. And that's part of the goal of law liberation is to really from the ground up lift up different projects and thinking. So yeah, when you mean anti-racist allocation of resources, community development, just um, we talked about resources, but I didn't talk about that specifically.
Yes, and I apologize because I do have another call.
Oh, yes.
This question, but I was like, I don't know if I need to write this person to let them know I'll be a little bit late. But
Right.
to go back to your point, so there's actually some really great research that I'm happy to share after around anti-racist community development. But I was writing in particular about how shifting resources to communities is an example of anti-racism community development, really centering in what communities say that they need, instead of developing out institutions and things that aren't grounded in that. And so that is the heart of it, but there's some really great research and experts that I can point
Yeah,
you to.
great. And just because we are at the time and you have to go, last question that I'm asking all our interviewees is what does liberation look, feel, mean to you? And if you want to take a breath and moment to think about it, or if you have it top of mind, and with that question, we'll end today.
I often feel what liberation feels like when I'm in community with folks that we are all pushing for, advocating for the same thing. We might come from different backgrounds, but we know that like we are each other's like access to liberation. Like we know that it is through our collective struggle together that like we are going to get what we ultimately want. And I've experienced that in lots of different formations, but I think more recently in the work that I do with the Bell Fund. And, every day we are actively trying to get people free out of jails and prisons. And most of us are volunteers. Like we aren't doing this for resources of our own. We're doing this because we want our community to members to be free, and we want to support them and show that there are other ways of support. And so that is how I see liberation, is folks that are coming together for collective care, for collective healing, and to help get each other free.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I feel like I can continue on, and hopefully maybe we can speak again. And I just want to thank you again. Liberatory Imagination will link a lot of the things that you organizations, your own organization, we'll link to that so folks can find it. But thank you so much.
Thank you.